So this application that you delivered to the Foreign Secretary on... Home Secretary on Wednesday, was it?
That's right.
On Wednesday. I mean, it's quite fascinating. To be honest, when you're looking at it from, for instance, my personal perspective, it makes absolute sense. And one might even argue that it's a long time coming. We'll come to that. But what is the basis upon which you and your colleagues have decided to bring this particular application?
Well, we're instructed by Hamas to bring the application, and they've taken the view that at the time was right for them to make this admittedly extraordinary address to the British government. And I mean, if it's helpful for context, of course, the application's being made under the Terrorism Act 2000, a flagship piece of Tony Blair's government's legislation. And what that act does, it sort of consolidates the precursor legislation that was trialled in the north of Ireland mostly to deal with groups in that context, in that conflict. And it consolidates them in this Terrorism Act 2000. And broadly, it's pretty clear that what that act does is to empower the Secretary of State for the Home Department to put organisations on a list. And once an organisation is on that list, a number of criminal offences sort of kick in. And that includes the obvious stuff that I think the average person on the street understands, right? If you express support for a proscribed organisation, if you join a proscribed organisation, if you wear its uniform, if you organise a meeting with it, all of those things become criminalised. And so the application is made under Section 4 of that Act. It's a dubious piece of legislation, in my opinion. I think the Terrorism Act 2000 is a full frontal assault on people's free speech rights, and that's what it's intended to be. It's clear criminalising certain speech acts is a deliberate attempt to regulate speech. It's a very heavy-handed mechanism. So whatever we think of the legislation in general, it does have provision under Section 4 for organisations or people affected by any such prescription to make an application. And so there are a number of reasons that went into my client's sort of strategy and their desire to make this application, but I suppose those questions are more a matter for them. All I can say is that Fahad Ansari at Riverway Law has instructed me, and I helped with drafting the application, and now we've submitted it.
To make absolutely clear from the very start, and you've pressed on this even in the press conference that you held on Wednesday morning in central London, that this has nothing to do with glorifying or with praising or with celebrating Hamas per se.
That's right. It's good to be clear about this, isn't it? Because it's as I've said, as soon as you start dealing with the Terrorism Act 2000 and organisations that have been proscribed pursuant to that act, you're in difficult territory, and that's the intention of the act. And so the formulation that I've come up with that I think will help people who aren't trained lawyers to understand how to navigate this discourse, this discussion, is that you can talk about the application and you can support the application, but what you must not do is support the organisation that's making the application, because if you do that, you will be committing a criminal offence in the United Kingdom.
But still, I'm pretty sure that since, the hours that that came after the announcement or the submission of the application to the Home Secretary, I'm pretty sure that you were inundated with comments and lines and headlines and attacks and the like, accusing you of actually supporting or celebrating or glorifying Hamas. I'm pretty sure, but because you've entered into a very, very precarious area that, legally you might have set the boundaries, but in the public eye, in today's, world of social media and sensationalism and all of that, I'm pretty sure that you predicted what has been and what will come.
Well, who knows what the future holds, right? God knows. I have done my best to act in a way that's professional. I've put a lot of work into the submissions that I drafted, which I think contain persuasive arguments. I think it's worth talking about the context, right? It's not my fault that Tony Blair's government decided to pass the Terrorism Act 2000. It's not my fault that he decided to make it, him and his government decided to make it so difficult to talk about often quite intractable conflicts. And so, of course, we do have to be careful. And I do feel somewhat privileged as a barrister who knows the law and is able to very clearly understand how these lines operate. I'm able to navigate the discourse with slightly more precision because of that. And it's not the case for people who haven't had the time for obvious reasons to study the law as much as I have. It is difficult for people to navigate this discourse, certainly in this country. And that's part of the grounds of the application, that people want to be able to talk about a genocide, right? That's the way that I would frame this, right? A genocide is happening. That's the real context. I don't think you can understand the application without understanding that context. And yet what's happening in practice is that people are wary about talking about their disgust, how disturbed they feel, how angry they feel, that the British government stands accused not just of complicity in the mass murder of Palestinians, but in actually participating in that genocide, right? Flying surveillance flights over Gaza from their military base in Cyprus, providing staunch diplomatic support, selling weapons to the Israeli regime as it commits genocide. So people want to talk about how disgusting it is that Britain is yet again collaborating with an apartheid regime, just as it did in South Africa. They want to be able to speak freely about it, and yet they are self-censoring. That's absolutely clear to anyone who's following this discourse. And that's almost everyone, because who can ignore the genocide we've been witnessing for the last 18 months? People want to talk about it, but these laws make people feel very, very wary, and they over-censor. These are people who may not support Hamas at all. They may politically oppose Hamas.
Absolutely.
They may support other groups in Palestine who aren't proscribed, but they will censor to a degree that they wouldn't if these speech laws weren't in place. So it is tricky. It's very tricky to navigate, and I'm doing my best. I'm only one person. All I can do is respond to my instructions. I'm instructed to draft and make an application. That's what I've done. But also clearly, it's like the discussion around the application very quickly gets out of my hands. There's only so much I can do to try to make sure that people don't cross the criminal red lines that the government has chosen to create. But I don't bear responsibility for that. The British government does.
I mean, I don't think I'm stepping over any lines when I say that I commend you and your team for your bravery and the principled stand that you have assumed. But I'd like you to tell me a little bit about the application itself.
Sure.
On what legal premise was it based? How was it constructed? I saw 2 quite hefty volumes yesterday at the press conference. What's in them?
Well, I suppose the short answer is that people who want to understand the application can read the documents themselves. They've been made available on a website by my instructing solicitor, hamascase.com. So in some ways, the pleadings speak for themselves. It's the document that I drafted is what we call the submission sometimes. And that runs to about 100 pages. And in some ways, some people think that law is quite a almost mathematical or scientific science, right? Like 2 + 2 is 4, and there's this right answer. But in my experience, there's a hefty creative aspect to legal drafting, right? You have to make certain decisions, you have to make certain judgment calls, and that's obviously what we've had to do in this case. And there seems to be an unspoken rule at the bar that 3 arguments is a pretty good rule of thumb, right? Plato's rule of 3. So clearly there's all kinds of ways that we could have tried to make the argument that the decision to proscribe was unlawful or that it is unlawful. Some background context then, of course, Hamas's military wing was proscribed more than 2 decades ago.
This is Al-Qassam brigades.
That's right. So that was made illegal more than 2 decades ago. And then the more recent decision was taken by the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, obviously a very controversial figure herself, stands accused of sort of these backroom deals with...
Yeah, she was actually fired from the Theresa May government.
Exactly. There's no ambiguity about this.
Yeah.
So impropriety in the way that she dealt with the apartheid state of Israel. She made the decision to proscribe, back in 2021, the political wing. Now, that's quite an astonishing departure because... the British government, even when you think about the Troubles, again, you had this precursor legislation that has all the birthmarks of the Terrorism Act 2000. The Provisional IRA, for example, the INLA, Irish National Liberation Army, these were proscribed, but their political wings, Sinn Féin, IRSP, right, Irish Republican Socialist Party, these organizations were not proscribed. And it's my understanding that the received wisdom was that, look, you prescribe the military wing because they are engaged, it's a military wing, they're engaged in what they say is a national liberation struggle, what the British state says is terrorism. So they make a decision to prescribe the military wing, but they don't prescribe the political wing because that tends to shut down the kind of political dialogue that in the case of the North of Ireland led to the Good Friday Agreement.
Correct.
And a much more peaceful province where I come from today. You know, we have that that dialogue even at the height of the Troubles, they never proscribed Sinn Féin. And there were atrocities. Clearly, civilians were killed by the Provisional IRA. And even when that was happening, the British government still said, we're not going to prescribe Sinn Féin. And it's worth noting, I mean, I'm not trying to put all of the blame for civilian deaths at the door of Irish republicanism. Clearly, the British state also bore responsibility for murdering civilians. Bloody Sunday is the highest watermark of that, right? Yeah. Members of the British Army with machine guns murdering unarmed Catholic Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association protesters, right? That's 1972. It's the start of the Troubles. So I'm very familiar with the Irish example. It's addressed extensively in the application. And then we also have the South African example, right? True. Mandela is perhaps the clearest example of this, right? And I'm not making any kind of direct analogy between Hamas and Mandela. That would be crass and it would be blunt. But we do learn something about how states, and specifically the British state, have wielded this concept of terrorism to try to suppress speech about organizations they disagree with. And although, hindsight is 2020 and everyone now, bar a few exceptions, accepts that Nelson Mandela was one of the most courageous freedom fighters of his generation, at the time, it's really worth remembering that Margaret Thatcher's government supported the apartheid regime in South Africa to the hilt. And that regime sought the execution of Nelson Mandela because he founded the armed wing. That's the crucial point.
I was actually talking to a few friends about this just earlier today. I was, my own personal political awakening came amid the student protests in Manchester against, apartheid in South Africa. And I recall very, very well two things. First of all, the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, saying that this terrorist will never walk the streets of London. A few years after he was received at Buckingham Palace by the Queen. And also T-shirts of attendees of the Conservative Party annual conference saying, "Hang Mandela." I remember that absolutely clearly. And, to tell this to my own kids today, who are finding their feet in amid world politics, to tell them that one day the government of the day, the government of the UK, was perpetuating and calling for the hanging of Nelson Mandela is to them something which is borderline impossible.
Absolutely. But I think it's really worth dwelling on. Because, we see this in the Irish example as well, but it seems as though British people struggle to see the Irish example clearly. The Irish see as something of a gulf in this regard. We see that conflict very, very differently. You take a figure like Bobby Sands, he's around the world, he's regarded as essentially similar to Mandela, right? An incredibly courageous man. Whatever you think of his politics, and he was on the Army Council of the Provisional IRA. Clearly, he was the member of a proscribed organization. That's not in dispute. And if memory serves, I think that's why he was in prison, right? He was serving a sentence, I think, for membership of the Provisional IRA. That's why he found himself in the Maze prison in the first place.
And he was in his 20s.
He was 27 years old when he
died.
Yeah. So he died, obviously, for those who don't know, he died on hunger strike, protesting Thatcher's policy of criminalization. So there's that word again, right? Like, no, you're not allowed to be a member of this. They call themselves an army. We say they're just thugs. That was her line. And she famously said, crime is crime is crime. It is not political. Yes. And then he ran in a by-election because the sitting MP had died, I think, of a heart attack. And attempted to, he succeeded in showing that how can you say that we're just these common criminals? You might disagree with us, but we have a degree of support within the Catholic community that you cannot ignore. True. And it was only by talking to the political wing of the IRA that the peace agreement was eventually concluded. The South African example is very, very hopeful, I think. The actions of the post-apartheid South African government during this genocide have been a ray of hope in extremely dark times. I think we mustn't become numb to the meaning of the word genocide and the fact that, as you and I are talking, Palestinians are being murdered right now because they are Palestinian. They're being murdered because of their race and because they're viewed as a sort of demographic threat to the racial purity of Israel's apartheid state, right? So-called Jewish state, which it's
also noting, by the way, that regardless of whether they support Hamas or support any other Palestinian faction, regardless, they're all being killed.
Exactly, and the ICJ, to come back to the question of law and the specific legal authorities in this area, the ICJ has been quite helpful, in part because South Africa has brought this case, and a growing number of nations, including EU member states, right? Ireland, interestingly, again, the Irish Sea proving this gulf, right? UK participating in a genocide, while Ireland joins the case alleging that Israel is committing a genocide. So the ICJ has been helpful in various ways. You've got the ICJ judgment in the South Africa case from January, which quoted some of the most senior Israeli officials saying the most openly genocidal things. And as you say, Isaac Herzog is one of the people quoted in that judgment. And he doesn't say even the Palestinians of Gaza are responsible. He says an entire nation is responsible. So he singles out the entire Palestinian nation and then talks explicitly about how, it's not true, this idea that there are innocent civilians in Gaza. So he explicitly says it's not about just targeting Hamas. It's not about targeting the military wing of Hamas. It's about an entire nation is responsible. So it's the logic of a genocide. And part of the application is attempting to show the way that the British government's proscription decision, though it predated the genocide, has come to form part of the logic of that genocide in which Britain is participating. So that is a crucial part of the argument. But I think, we can talk about the legal complexity. It's as I've said, I think it's been said to some people who've read them and messaged me about them, that the submissions are relatively readable for legal submissions. They do remain legal submissions, but they've been written in quite a plain way. That's my preferred drafting style. I try to speak very plainly. I know that the law can be a bit mystifying and a bit full of jargon, but broadly I think it's common sense with bells on, and that's how I've tried to my colleagues and I have tried to draft this application. But in addition to the drafting and the arguments themselves, which hopefully speak for themselves, I do think it's important to just stress the wider context here. You talked about, when we were talking earlier, there was this question of timing, and that's come up time and time again. Why now? And I think the obvious answer to that is that Zionism is in a terminal crisis. That's what it seems like to me. It's certainly in a crisis. It seems as though it's a terminal crisis. It seems difficult to see how Zionism comes back from this, from the damage that it's done to its own reputation by massacring so many Palestinian children and the way that massacre, that genocide has been live streamed. It seems as though, there's no basis for doubting now as a matter of international law that Israel is an apartheid state. And the legal definition of apartheid is actually very clarifying in my view, right? It's about a system of racial domination by one racial group over another, right? And I think some people get uncomfortable, perhaps understandably, when people talk about racial domination by Jews over Palestinians, which is what we talk about when we talk about Israeli apartheid, because they think the allegation is that we're accusing Jews of racial domination. That's not the allegation. The allegation is against the state of Israel creating a system in which, just like the South African apartheid state created a system of domination by white people over black people, no one's blaming all white people for the actions of the South African government, right? So that's the crucial point. And so you can't understand this application without understanding that we are witnessing the collapse of Israeli apartheid in real time. And that raises the question, what is going to happen the day after? What's going to be the 1994 South Africa moment? What's going to be the 1998 Good Friday Agreement moment for Palestinians? Yeah. And it seems likely that in both of those historical examples, South Africa and Ireland, what's absolutely clear is that it was not possible to achieve the durable, peaceful solutions that we see in both those countries without talking to people like the Provisional IRA and its political wing, like the Tip of the Spear and its political wing, right, the African National Congress, and specifically speaking to people who were clearly winning elections. Once you start winning elections, it seems clear, history tells us, that even if you strongly disagree with the political choice of the Palestinian people, you have to speak to the people they've elected. Otherwise, you end up with the alternative, which is the genocide that we're witnessing. It's part of the logic of refusing to talk to the people that Palestinians elected in 2006.
I find it fascinating that you talk about the 1994 South African moment, the 1998 Irish moment, and you speak as though there will be a Palestinian moment. You're not saying if, you're saying when.
The alternative doesn't really bear thinking about, right? I say that rhetorically, but I suppose we have to be courageous in the middle of this genocide, and we have to try to think about what the alternative to Israel collapsing might look like. I mean, in my opinion, that's some kind of one-state solution, which is a democracy of all its citizens, Jewish, non-Jewish, Palestinian, all people living in harmony, and it will take generations to heal the wounds. But that project of one single democratic state seems like the most hopeful solution to me, just as it does, and I'm not painting again a false equivalence because it would be obscene, but with Ireland, a lot of people think that a single united Irish state is the better alternative to this scar, as it's described, that runs across the island of Ireland, right? So we have these historical precedents of hopeful solutions to these kinds of conflicts, but if such a solution doesn't emerge, I mean, people talk about the two-state solution in Palestine, but I mean, the Israeli government deliberately destroyed that solution, right? I mean, it's the bipartisan consensus since 1967 of all Israeli governments that they should illegally colonize the West Bank. The government explicitly endorses and incentivizes people to engage in that kind of settlement activity. And so it was a deliberate attempt.
It seems that the entire world was engaged with a two-state solution apart from Israel.
Yeah, exactly.
The only party that wasn't engaged, that was deliberately working against the two-state solution, seemed to be Israel.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I also think it's pretty clear that the two-state solution was a fig leaf, a smokescreen. It was a distraction that the Zionist state used to try and distract people while it continued to colonize. And there's now, 750,000 or something illegal settlers in the West Bank. That was supposed to be the main territory that was going to form the basis for a Palestinian state. Oslo was supposed to be the process by which that state was going to emerge. It's absolutely clear, if there was ever any hope of a two-state solution, that Israel deliberatly destroyed it. And now they're openly saying that. The increasingly fascist government in Israel is saying that. And so I suppose there's so many ways to describe this application, because in some ways it's extraordinary, but in other ways it's merely speaking about my broader practice. I mean, since before the genocide, I represented a lot of Palestinian people, represented cases that relate to Palestine, the question of Palestine. I represented an anti-Zionist, Jewish asylum seeker who didn't want to serve in the Israeli military. So I've been thinking about these issues in a legal context in British courts for a long time. And the phenomenon I often encounter is this bizarre kind of emperor's new clothes thing, where everyone has to pretend that Israel is this respectable democracy, and everyone knows that it's not, that it's naked racial domination, to stick with that metaphor, right? It's like the emperor has no clothes. There's nothing hiding the nudity of this racial violence. It's not hiding anywhere. It's so easy to cite. You go from 1950 basic law, like in some ways the bedrock of Israel's racializing apartheid constitution, says every Jew may return, right? Direct race discrimination at the very foundation of the state. Fast forward to whenever it is, 2018 or 2017, the nation state law that says the right to self-determination is exclusive to the Jewish people. And you've got, I remember quoting in one of my skeleton arguments in an asylum claim, Benjamin Netanyahu, now of course a fugitive of international law, he said Israel is not a state of all its citizens. So they're not even hiding it. Like, Zionists have never felt the need to hide the naked racism on which Zionism is built. But for some reason, when you go into a British court, you're supposed to pretend that the emperor has clothes. And I, before October 2023, would go into court and sort of say, well, look, Amnesty have said it now, Human Rights Watch have said it, it's an apartheid regime, it's doing racial domination. And in some ways, the high watermark of this was, I remember submitting something like 30-page skeleton argument talking about apartheid in one of my asylum claims. And I received a judgment back that did not mention the word apartheid once. Wow. That's the level of emperor's new clothes. And I'm like, look, the emperor's not wearing clothes. You at least need to address my argument about whether or not the emperor's wearing clothes. And the response from the bench came back that he's wearing clothes.
And it's fascinating because I've lost count of how many South Africans who lived through the apartheid era continue to say the very same line, and that is, the situation in Israel is far worse than we had it.
Of course.
I mean, time and time again, South Africans themselves, who are part of this struggle for equality, for justice, for democracy, are saying what's happening in Palestine under the Israeli rule is far worse than we ever had it. I mean, if anyone knows anything about apartheid, it must be the South Africans.
I think this is fascinating, because thinking about what you're saying, right, you're kind of talking about, among the ways of parsing what you're talking about is that you're talking about identity, right? And you were saying, well, look, South Africans can be identified by their experience of racial domination. They can be identified by the collective process by which they've attempted to overcome it. Of course, scars remain in South Africa, but broadly much more peaceful and much less nakedly racist. And I think that's right. I think that one's own experience, one's personal experience, one's collective group experience, whether it be because you're a black person or because you're a woman or whatever it might be, whatever experience of oppression you might have, I think it provides an empathetic bridge to someone else's suffering. But I also think that there's a limit to that. And I think about this with Irishness quite a lot, right? There's a risk that Irish people make a false equivalence between the Irish struggle and the Palestinian struggle. There are these similarities. They're both anti-colonial struggles. Yeah. They're both fighting against the same colonizer, because Britain is so deeply implicated in the colonization of Palestine and the genocide today. But actually, the risk with that framing, I do think it's helpful to appeal to say, well, look, as Irish people, you've experienced colonialism. Surely you should show solidarity to Palestinians as they face far greater level of violence than anything Irish people have experienced, certainly recently. I suppose the Irish famine is, economic mass murder. So this is the problem with crass, simplistic metaphors, right? You can look at the similarities, but you have to also look at the differences.
Right.
And you have to also appeal to British people and say, look, the mere fact that you're in the belly of one of the most violent colonial empires in human history, and that's not me being nasty, that's just an obvious historical fact, right? And again, the emperor's new clothes metaphor. It's like British people, British judges in particular, anxious to talk about just how violent their empire was, right? I think we can and should appeal to British people to support this application. Like, look, you don't have to be Irish or a black South African to think I'm a human. Like Zionism is this staggering affront to Palestinian dignity. It's clearly unraveling, to stick with that metaphor, right? The garment is completely unraveling, and there's nothing left to hide the nudity of Zionist racism. Zionism seems to be in an absolute inescapable crisis. It cannot resolve the contradiction of claiming to be a democracy while treating non-Jews like they're a racial threat. And you cannot understand this application without understanding that, I mean, again, God knows what the future holds. And if I'm wrong, then it must be some kind of horrific fascist hellhole where people are allowed to commit genocide and get away with it. I mean, and it's not hyperbole to say fascism, right? Like, I'm thinking about Belazar Smotrich, right? Yeah. Like, he openly says it. Like, when, the received wisdom is when someone tells you what they are, believe them, right? He tells us, quote, fascist homophobe. Why would we doubt that he's a fascist? Yeah. So it's again, with the emperor's new clothes, you can go into an English court, as I did in the High Court a few weeks ago on an unrelated case. You can go into the English High Court and say, well, it's a matter of fact that Israel's governed by fascists. Like, at least some of the current cabinet tell us that they're fascists. Why would it be? There's these allegations of anti-Semitism that get leveled against anyone who makes that comparison. It's not a comparison. Belazar Smotrich tells us he's a fascist. I mean, he's the finance minister.
Just before we were recording, I was going through my X feed. It used to be my Twitter feed. And I read that from the Washington Post, I believe, that Smotrich said that not a grain will be allowed to enter Gaza. I mean, who on earth, who else will be able to say such a thing and get away with it as though it's just like the sun's out today?
Well, exactly. A fascist seems to be getting away with it. But and Ben-Gvir comes in for particular criticism as well in the pleadings that we drafted and the evidence. I suppose what I would say is, again, when I touched previously on identity, I think the British state is contradictory, and I'm not here to let it off the hook. Like, the application is a challenge to the British state, and I've been attempting to challenge the British state for my entire time in legal practice, at least. But it is a contradictory thing. The British state has different tendencies, and there are a lot of people within the British state, within the state apparatus, who are quietly extremely critical of the fact that that government is engaged in a genocide, right? Helping Israel to commit a genocide, sending it bombs, diplomatic support, all the rest of it. And it's contradictory, right? We had Professor David Miller's judgment, which sent shockwaves through the English legal system, right? Correct. Establishing that anti-Zionism can be a protected philosophical belief in, under the Equality Act. We've had the ongoing arms sales challenge, right? So a judicial review trying to challenge the legality of arms sales, riffing off of the similar challenge in the case of Saudi Arabia and its role in Yemen. We've got a growing number of asylum claims brought by both Palestinians from all different parts of the fragmented territory of Palestine, right? Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and 48, right? So even Palestinian citizens of Israel saying, look, he's saying an entire nation is responsible. That's the president of an apartheid state saying an entire nation is responsible. There's no reason to believe that Palestinians will be safe, even if they have an Israeli passport. So I think across the English legal system, increasingly, it is possible. You don't have to be a good lawyer. All of my colleagues, I think, have imposter syndrome. It just seems to come with the job. And so I often feel like I'm not very good at making legal arguments. I just feel this moral duty almost to go into court and say, sorry, can we just admit, whatever else you want to do, my lord, judge, whoever I'm addressing, can we just admit that what we're witnessing is the mass murder of Palestinians because they're not Jewish? Like, that's what's happening. Can we just call a spade a spade? And I've got in the habit of putting ICJ judgments in my bundle of authorities and just, as we've done in this case, in this application, take them to the ICJ. Like, look, it's not me. It's not my opinion. The ICJ has said it is apartheid. It is ethnic cleansing. It's an illegal occupation, which has lasted for more than half a century. The ICC has handed down arrest warrants against the former defense minister and the current sitting prime minister.
Absolutely.
This is why I say, like, who can say what the future holds? But it seems, to anyone who's actually serious about analysing what's happening, it seems as though it's a terminal crisis. Israel is doing what South Africa did in 1994. It's doing what the sort of system in Ireland did leading up to the 1998 agreement. It's like, look, this is unsustainable. It's profoundly anti-democratic, and the violence will continue for as long as Zionism does.
I'd like to come back in a little bit to the application itself, but before that, very interesting listening to you, because I wonder how much of your background as someone from Ireland do you bring into this understanding or appreciation or perspective into Palestine and what's happening? Well,
look, I'm obviously here in my...
And again, I do recognize the fact that we're not comparing like for like.
Yeah, of course not. I do think I'm here in my capacity as a lawyer, right? And that puts me in this interesting position. There's this idea, again, this unsatisfying understanding of law as mathematics, right? So it's like you've got these different calculators, and in whatever calculator you'll use, you'll get the same result. And that's just not true. It's a kind of a myth that the system rests on, right? In practice, 2 lawyers, 3 opinions or whatever. Same with judges, whatever. It's like there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to run a case. And so clearly, at the criminal bar, there's this convention among some solicitors and clients of saying, oh, I'm accused of racism against black people, I should make sure that I get a black barrister, which is a bit obnoxious, but it's this quite cynical kind of optics exercise. And then there is this idea that, as well, that, we're not calculators, we're humans. And of course, we bring our personal experience to our briefs, we bring our interests to our briefs. I should say that when it comes to my relationship to this case, it's proving quite tricky. I think the British establishment has been quite slow to respond to the application. That was obviously all over the news yesterday. And I think that they've been slow to respond because I don't think they really know how to respond properly. And so it's taken them time almost to parse what's actually being said in this application. It's quite a detailed application. So presumably they're still reading it and getting to grips with it. 600 pages of evidence and pleadings. So in fairness to them, they have a lot to get through. And we've obviously been thinking about it for a long time and done a lot of work on it, whereas they're still getting up to speed. But I do think there's something deeper going on. I think normally you would have expected the media to pick up on it more quickly, and it seems to be. They're only now. It's more than 24 hours since the application was submitted.
Is it that maybe the application stunted them, shocked them?
I think that they are not sure how to respond, because it's almost like Section 4 is this, which is the process by which you make the application. It's supposed to be this kind of afterthought, like, well, I suppose in principle, if we are committed to the rule of law, we should probably let people challenge these astonishing decisions to completely suppress people's, freedom of speech and so on, and to create all these criminal offences. So in theory, right, fine, you can make an application. And that's part of why it's been quite an interesting legal exercise. Normally, when you draft an application, you're representing someone to claim asylum, there's mountains of case law talking about how you claim asylum, what the principles are. When it comes to de-proscribing an organisation and making an application of that,
there's not much.
There's hardly anything to go on. There's a few authorities, and so in some ways we've had to be quite creative in part because we've not been hemmed in by the authorities in the way that you'd normally expect. And then just one final thing that I think on this point, which I think is quite important, and I'm grateful to you for giving me a sort of a fair hearing and a space to express myself. And I imagine some of the interviews that I have in the coming days with much more hostile media will be much more difficult. I'm already getting the emails, and my colleagues are getting the emails. And what's clear is that there's a principle that you're not supposed to conflate a lawyer with his client. And it's extremely dangerous to do so. And the British, or the English bar, the English legal system, the British legal system, says it respects that, and parts of the legal system, the actual lawyers, tend to respect that because they can see that they have a personal interest in establishing, like, look, if I acted for someone who's done X or Y or Z, I am not that person, I'm representing them, and our system of law rests on the idea that people should be entitled to lawyers, even if the lawyer doesn't agree with what their client has done, right? And what's also clear is that principle of not conflating lawyers with their clients, there's a sordid history of senior figures in the British establishment deliberately violating that principle when a lawyer does something that they don't like, or when a lawyer shows themselves to consistently do things that the British establishment doesn't like. More recently, we have this example of politicians like Priti Patel, former Home Secretary, we mentioned Boris Johnson, obviously, these right-wing politicians, and I think it's fair to say elements of the Labour Party as well, talking about activist lawyers, trying to criticise lawyers for representing migrants, and then putting a target on their backs. They know what they're doing. They're blaming the lawyers. Oh, the reason there's all these migrants here is because these lawyers are representing them. Right? They knew what they were doing. They did it anyway. And the sordid low point of that episode was a man showing up with a knife, a far right, a fascist, shows up to a well-known immigration law firm, asking for a solicitor by name because he had heard him talking about a case involving a migrant on the news. Wow. So that's what the British establishment will do when it doesn't like lawyers. And the much darker example, again, crossing the Irish Sea, the much darker example, and that's not to diminish the fact that a man was attacked by a knife, that's horrific. The much darker example, names that I grew up listening to. I remember being driven to school by my mother, and there was a gable wall. We're fond of a gable wall in the north of Ireland. And it said, Rosemary Nelson, murdered by RUC, right? So that's why I grew up, age of 5, 6. I remember this happening when I was a young kid. She was murdered, a human rights lawyer. That's where I come from. I come from this place where when the lawyers are too good at what they do, they're too good at challenging the state, the British state says,
kill them, get rid of them.
And obviously, I'm not going to disinter the facts of Rosemary Nelson's case, but as far as that gable wall was concerned, we grew up with these names, like, Rosemary Nelson, and then your father explains to you, that's who Rosemary Nelson is. And then the name that more British people might be familiar with is Pat Finucane, right? A formidable solicitor in the north of Ireland, represented a lot of people in the IRA and other Republican groups. And as I understand it, a British MP stood up in Parliament, said, there are some solicitors in the north of Ireland who identify rather too closely with their clients, or words to that effect. Everyone, it was a dog whistle. Everyone who was paying attention knew he was talking about Pat Finucane. 3 weeks later, the man was dead, having been murdered in front of his family by loyalist paramilitaries who we now know were being handled by British secret services. And the family have never had an answer. There's an ongoing campaign, of course, for justice. And I'm not here to speak for that family, but they obviously have my full support in seeking justice in the outrageous murder of that formidable man. So I am not in any way trying to compare myself to Pat Finucane. I wouldn't dream of it. He's one of the people who inspired me to become a lawyer. But that's the game that these people are playing with. That's the game that the right-wing media are currently playing with me and my colleagues, trying to put a target on our back, trying to dredge up things that we've tweeted in a personal capacity, things we might have done in a personal capacity, and make the story about us instead of about this case and this application and this genocide. They know exactly what they're doing. And if negative consequences, if dark consequences follow from their actions, it will be because they willfully disregarded the very important convention that you do not conflate a lawyer with their client. I am not my client. I've been instructed by a solicitor to make a legal application, and I've done that to the best of my ability.
Excellent. Back to the application just a little bit before I move on, but you also had a segment where experts, witnesses wrote, academics and the like, historians. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say that's the bulk of the reading. To anyone who wants to read the documents, that's what's
you
going to
had
take
about 20.
That's right, 20 expert witnesses, about 500 pages odd of expert testimony. And that's a big part of our approach, was to attempt to evidence. It's obviously you have the law and the legal arguments, and then you have the evidence. And we attempted to show from some truly stellar experts. And I want to personally express my gratitude to them for all of the work that they put in. Like the legal team, they did it pro bono as well, because the client is on a sanctions list. It's not possible for us to receive payment without jumping through some very onerous hoops. So everyone's working pro bono to try and just evidence what should be obvious, right? All of these facts about, a lot of the expertise has nothing to do with Hamas. It has to do with the history, it has to do with the context, it has to do with some of the concepts. So John Dugard, who a lot of people will be familiar with, again, one of the most formidable lawyers of his generation, it's an absolute privilege to read his report. He talks about, he submitted a report in support of the application, where he talks about this, frankly, rhetorical device that Zionists sometimes use. They talk about Israel's right to exist. And he writes a report eviscerating that, just pointing out it's not a concept known to international law. A state doesn't have the right to exist. So that's one of the reports. And I should say in passing, I thought it was amusing. I saw Douglas Murray recently debating Mehdi Hassan. I just saw a clip of it on social media, as you do, and he was coming out with this nonsensical example about Pakistan. And I just thought of all the examples to choose. He was saying, no one would say that Pakistan doesn't have the right to exist. And I thought, well, hold on. Pakistan emerged out of the British Empire, which people said didn't have the right to exist. That's literally why Pakistan emerged. So it emerged out of people questioning the existence of an existing border, if you will. Yeah. And then, of course, you have East and West Pakistan. Yeah. And the emergence of Bangladesh is premised on the idea that Bangladesh, as it was constituted, shouldn't exist. So I just think this is, again, further evidence of the terminal crisis of Zionism. Like these right-wing hacks like Douglas Murray can't even come up with a coherent defense of this genocide, because how could you? So John Dugard's report is brilliant in that regard, and I encourage people to read that.
I read a little bit of Avi Shleim's. Avi Shleim being an Israeli Jew, someone who's of well-known stature at Oxford.
Absolutely.
And his testimony was, the bit that I read was quite profound.
Yeah, no, he's been formidable. And obviously we met with all the experts, we had various meetings with them, and I just can't thank them enough. I can't thank Avi Shleim enough. Lending his weight and his insight and his credibility to the evidence that supports the application, and the way that he talks about it, and even just, I hope I'm not overstepping the mark by talking about the journey that man has gone on. Because we talked about identity, and I was talking about British people, not feeling like, oh well, I'm not Irish like Frank, so he must find it easier to support this application. I don't think that's right. I think anyone can choose the correct position, and to again name the elephant in the room and to state the obvious. That applies to Jews, right? Like, absolutely. I'm experiencing this genocide in my own way. Everyone experiences it in their own way. I've been thinking a lot about survivor's guilt, to be honest, and a bit emotional with you. It's like I feel incredibly guilty that I haven't done more, and I think for the rest of my life I will think about the ways I could have done more during this genocide. And I've tried to do what I can, and I am coming under attack for it. But I don't want to paint a false equivalence between what I'm going through and the Palestinians. It's nothing compared to what the Palestinians are going through. So my direct appeal to Jewish people is to have very difficult conversations with yourself and with members of your community, the Jewish community. And I know those conversations are happening. Yeah. I'm here to salute those Jews who have stuck their head above the parapet and said to family members, to members of their community, I understand that this is supposedly being done in our name. Yeah. I understand that this is supposedly the Jewish state. I don't want this done in my name. I'm walking away from Zionism. And I know that that's difficult. I think that, and you talk about the personal, my family, my mother is French, and so I sort of almost straddle this colonial divide, right? And I think my mother has been incredibly supportive of my legal career, and she's incredibly supportive of this. But I think in some ways coming from that Irish tradition has made my experience of the genocide somewhat different to a Jewish person. And a lot of the anti-Zionist Jewish folks that I've spoken to have talked about the personal consequences of having the correct position on all of this, right? Like family members, parents saying, I'll never speak to you again. So I'm not here to say that it's easy. But having said, having made a direct address and directly invited your Jewish members of your audience to have those difficult conversations with yourself and others, and to acknowledge that Zionism is in terminal crisis, and to make the decision to walk away from it and to choose anti-Zionism, to resist Zionism, the proper people, the identity, if you will, the group that must be centered, of course, is Palestinians.
And countless of Jews have made that journey, have crossed that bridge.
Absolutely.
In the demonstrations that have been going on now for nigh on a year and a half, a hefty bulk of those hundreds of thousands every single week are the Jews who absolutely shout from the rooftops that they have nothing to do with the crimes of Israel, that they support the Palestinian victims, that they support the rights of the Palestinian people. And to be perfectly honest, they have been the bulk that have negated or countered the accusation of anti-Semitism and of being hate marches like Suella Braverman accused those marches of. So, countless, not only here in the UK, across Europe, as well as in America and Canada, have made that journey, have made that call.
And that's part of why I say, I think that's part of why it's so clear that Zionism is in terminal crisis, because Zionism depends on saying things like every Jew may return to Israel as an Olay, and then saying Israeli citizens have to serve in the military for 3 or 2 years, depending on their gender, with some exceptions. And it's this racialized colonial military that's being done in the name of Jewish security that's clearly not making Jews any safer. That's absolutely clear. And that's not to downplay the Holocaust. The Holocaust is horrific. It was a horrific crime against humanity. It's one of the most, it's possibly the most horrific thing that humans have ever done to each other. And the question of Jewish security in the wake of the Holocaust is one that we must take extremely seriously, especially at a moment when fascism is on the rise. Anti-Semitism is absolutely a serious form of racism, and this is something we go into in the application, right? But what's also clear is that because Israel has chosen to self-racialize and call itself the Jewish state and pass all of these apartheid laws, it makes fighting anti-Semitism that much more difficult because our definitions of anti-Semitism that seem to predominate, certainly in a country like this, are completely broken and not fit for purpose. The IHRA being the chief culprit, the author of that definition having said it's being misused to suppress Palestinian speech, it's irredeemably broken. It's being used to shelter Zionism and Israel from totally legitimate criticism on the spurious basis that it's anti-Semitic. But, I had said that the correct focus is on the Palestinians. I think there's a way of almost blending, because, in some ways, Zionism is identity politics on steroids, right? It's this very material manifestation of an idea that a Jewish identity should be hardwired into a so-called liberal democracy. And it's just a unresolvable contradiction. You cannot resolve it without extreme dehumanizing violence against Palestinians. Correct. And it's to the people of Palestine that I also want to use what platform you've given me, and for which I'm grateful. I want to talk to Palestinians. I suppose it's, as I've said, I'm here in my capacity representing Hamas to make this application, but I think it's permissible on this platform for me to use this opportunity to talk about, to address Palestinians directly, and to say, we are all sorry that we didn't do more, but millions of people in this country are on the side of the Palestinians. Millions of people marching through London every other Saturday. The tide is turning. This is the final crisis of Zionism, I think. It's, as I've said, the idea that Israel and Zionism would survive committing a genocide and not be replaced with something peaceful and democratic is unthinkable. We must make this the terminal crisis of Zionism. We cannot be complacent. And if it's right that Israel is in the process of collapsing, that its apartheid regime is going the way of South African apartheid, then that raises difficult questions for the Secretary of State. She has to think about the application and think seriously about the arguments that we make in it, and take seriously the idea that if you're going to have a peaceful solution, you have to speak to people, even and especially if you disagree with them, in circumstances where the Palestinian people voted for them in an election.
The decision to proscribe Hamas back in, 2018? Right.
2021, the political wing.
2021, the political wing. And it was done by the then Home Secretary, Priti Patel.
That's right.
Very important. This didn't go through the legal... any legal process. This was a mere political decision of a government of the day.
Yes, it's an executive decision, right? So to explain the process a bit, right, the Terrorism Act creates a power for the Secretary of State to add someone to the list, and then I think she lays that list before Parliament, so Parliament's aware of it, Parliament being the legislature, right? And again, for those of your followers, I'm sure that they're all familiar with the British Constitution, but it bears repeating that you have this idea of the separation of powers. You have the legislature, which is Parliament, and some devolved legislation. That's the body that writes the laws. And then you have the executive, which is empowered by the laws to execute them, hence executive. And then you have the judiciary, which is supposed to review both, right? And so what's happening in this case is that the Home Secretary, who's a member of the executive, and confusingly in the British case, obviously members of the executive also sit in the Parliament, so you have this merge between the executive and the legislature. The Home Secretary makes the decision, and then it's possible to challenge that decision. And the first instance process for doing so is to address her directly, the current Home Secretary, and to say, this decision has been made, we invite you to make a decision to remove the organisation from the list. So that doesn't involve the courts at that stage.
Absolutely.
And that's the stage that we're currently at, right? We've simply written an application to a member of the current cabinet and said, your predecessor proscribed the organisation, you're hereby invited for all of these reasons.
And it's within her authority, within her mandate or remit.
Absolutely. So she has 90 days. So we submitted it yesterday. She has 90 days to consider our arguments and make a decision, one way or the other. If she decides that for whatever reason, it might be that she agrees that there's a terminal crisis of Zionism, or it might be that she's persuaded by some other argument. I mean, that's the context. The arguments are, about freedom of speech and international law, and specifically talking about, yes, Hamas does use violence, but it's a settled principle of international law that occupied peoples are allowed to use armed force to resist their occupiers. So there's international law arguments that she may find persuasive. And there are broader arguments about relief efforts, right? Talking about the way that, look, sure, there's the military wing of Hamas. There's also the civilian administration in Gaza is, as you would expect of the de facto government. The street sweepers, the hospitals, all of these
nurses.
All of these pieces of civilian infrastructure have some connection or another to the civilian wing of Hamas.
Of course.
And so when people try to provide support for people who are living through a genocide that the British government is participating in, they're being impeded from doing so by the British government's own laws because it would seem to be, or people are worried that they might be committing a criminal offence by sending aid to people who are literally facing a genocide. So she may find those arguments persuasive. We're living through astonishing times.
And, it constantly baffles me. And, allow me here to raise the sort of racist colonial card. But, when I'm often confronted with someone who says, well, Hamas or Islamic Jihad or this, they are proscribed groups and you're not allowed. It never escapes me the fact that Hamas is proscribed by something like 23, 25 countries around the world, where more than 180 countries around the world do not proscribe Hamas, some of whom actually receive Hamas, openly celebrate Hamas, regardless of whether that's right or wrong. Hamas has bureaus in some of those countries. So, who's to say, simply because I happen to be a British citizen abiding by British laws, but if I was to holiday, let's say in Spain, I'd be absolutely fine talking to Hamas. This is where it becomes slightly on the absurd term, as though what our government decides is something that the entire world has to emulate, has to follow suit.
Well, this is so that is the current effect. To restate what we said at the start, right? Like, it would absolutely be an offence to go and meet with Hamas, because one of the offences created by the Terrorism Act is organising or arranging or attending a meeting with a proscribed organisation, right? And so the territorial scope of the Terrorism Act isn't limited to the United Kingdom, even though that is a relevant factor when considering whether or not to proscribe, right? It's the organisation in question and whether it has activities in Britain and so on. And that's obviously one of the arguments we make in this application, right? Hamas has never said that it intends to use violence in Britain. Its activities are confined to historic Palestine. But it would be a crime, and that's the intended effect. It's, as I've said, it's designed to make it very, very difficult to even talk about this issue, let alone, of course, commit any of the more obvious crimes of, joining a terrorist
funding
group,
it,
funding and all that kind of stuff. But it's Section 12 is the really wide provision, right? Expressing support, inviting support. You've got 12A offence. These are all crimes, and they're currently crimes. And it does make it very, very difficult for people to talk about genocide as it's happening, and in which the British government stands accused not merely of complicity, but of actual material participation, right? And I'm thinking as well about the current Prime Minister, right? We all saw that video of him talking about Israel's right to do various war crimes, right? Talking about collective punishment and so on. And he stands accused, as I understand it, of crimes under international law, right? So he's just on the record giving a carte blanche to his favourite apartheid state while it commits a genocide, and seems to have faced no criminal consequences.
Being of the legal background that we know,
knew exactly what he must have known what he was doing. And Tony Blair is the obvious elephant in the room, right? All these senior administrators of the British Empire who just get to engage in the most unspeakable things, do the most damaging things, ruin. Think about what Tony Blair did to Iraq, the Middle East. He's faced no criminal consequences, and yet a single mother who sees, tucks her children in at bed every night and then sees what we've all seen, some of the things we've seen, things that have changed us profoundly, sees that and says, this is horrible, and maybe accidentally, without thinking, crosses a line, is said to be glorifying a group that, it's, the disparity is perhaps as you'd expect, right? The powerful make laws in their own interests, and they use them to control those without power. But it seems as though the regime of the Terrorism Act is functioning as it is intended to. It's stopping people from talking about this issue. Even if they're extremely hostile to Hamas, people want to be able to talk about what is to be done about the genocide, and they want to talk about what happens if Israel is collapsing, if the apartheid state is crumbling under the weight of its own racist foundations. Then what does the day after look like? What does its 1994 South Africa moment look like? How do we talk about that without being able to talk to organizations that have been winning elections in Palestine?
And if the 90 days pass and Yvette Cooper doesn't respond positively?
Then we go from the executive to the legislature, to put it shortly, right? There's an organization created by the Terrorism Act called the Proscribed Organization Appeals Commission. That's a judicial body. And if the Secretary of State decides to reject our application, then we have a right of appeal, or I should say my client has a right of appeal. And if they choose to exercise it, the case will go before the POAC, right? And the judges there will have the power to overturn the decision using public law principles. And if they refuse to, or whatever they do, either party to those proceedings can bring an appeal to the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court, and thereafter the European Court of Human Rights.